So we've got quite an interesting and diverse set of speakers today. We've got some of the colleagues from TIPS, Dr. Saul Levine, that's going to be presenting to us. Really setting the stage for the importance of industrial policy and, where the climate crisis and this transition journey is positioned. After that, we have Gailo Momoson-Claire, who's no stranger to the world of renewable energy and has been very closely involved as a facilitator of the SAREM, the South African Renewable Energy Masterplan. And he's going to present some insights to us around local opportunities and the extent to which we can localize the renewable energy value chain. We're also joined today by a company called ModeTech, Gerald from ModeTech is going to really present to us on how they, as a private company, have pivoted towards being engaged with renewable energy and what some of the lessons they've learned through that process. And finally, we have Faisal from Sepao, who's going to present to us the trade union perspective. So what is it that unions really view as important in this transition journey that we're seeing in renewable energy, and what are some of the challenges and concerns they face around this transition journey? So quite a holistic and diverse set of presentations we have on the agenda today. In terms of the order of the presentation, so we're going to start with Saul, Gailo, Gerald, and then Faisal. I'll introduce each of the speakers in terms of their backgrounds prior to each presentation. Also, just a bit of housekeeping. So we'd like all of our online audience to keep themselves on mute while the presenters are presenting their inputs. Obviously, you're more than welcome to use the chat function if you have questions or if you have queries. We'll allow a few minutes after each input to take some burning questions, but we do have time for more detailed discussion afterwards. So the presentations are going to take us till about, say, 2:30 or so, and for the remainder of the session until 3 o'clock, we'll take questions. And we really want to have a lively discussion and debate, and I'm sure there's no shortage of questions around some of these very key, interesting issues that we see. I always save the best for last, and I forgot to introduce myself. So let me end with a very brief introduction. My name is Mohammed Patel. Some of you may know me. I'm a senior economist here at TIPS, and I work on sustainability issues as well as just transition issues. Okay, great. So with that short introduction, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Saul Levine, who many people know, is our executive director here at TIPS. He has a PhD in development studies from the University of Johannesburg, with his thesis focusing on industrial financing. Saul was previously a chief director in the Economic Development Department with oversight of the development finance institutions reporting to the EDD. So Saul's going to give us the first input, and he's really going to set the stage for us. That's going to take us through the remaining presentations. So without further ado, I call Saul to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be presenting just some initial thinking on the work that we're doing around greening industrial policy. And it's an area of work that's becoming increasingly important given some of the dynamics that we're seeing and the need to shift some of our thinking around the space. And it's an area that we're going to be doing a lot more research in over the coming years. Hopefully next time my colleagues Lesego and Lucas will be presenting, but I'm doing this initial presentation, and there is deeper work from the research team that is ongoing. Okay, so the key issues for industrial policy, so just to provide some ideas on how we're thinking about industrial policy. So part of it is, while there isn't a standard definition of what industrial policy is, we argue that it's around building industrial capacity and capabilities through policies that are aimed at changes in the production and ownership or the spatial structure of the economy. And then we're also arguing that it's linked to a value chain or industry, or support for a particular sector like small business, or a specific region. So some of these then inform how we've approached our analysis on greening industrial policy. Importantly, we see the role that industrial policy plays in addressing structural problems that are identified in the economy. But one of the important lessons in looking at industrial policy from other regions is that you can't just copy industrial policy, particularly because you've got unique circumstances in every country. So we've got the inequalities of apartheid and extraordinary joblessness in South Africa that persist, and that shapes how we think about industrial policy, but also the unusual heavy dependence on mining, particularly mining exports, and still for an upper middle income country. So when we look at other upper middle income countries, that puts us in a basket with a lot of the Central European countries, some of the East Asian economies. When we compare that, we see we do have quite a strong dependence on mining. And part of our assumptions around industrial policy is that the market won't give us the socially desired outcome. I think that's one of the things that we see why countries have adopted industrial policy and not just left things to the market to do, because it further entrenches some of the existing outcomes. So if we want to reshape our economy and we want to think about things differently, that's why we would take a proactive approach to building industrial capacity through our industrial policies. Industrial policy does that, but it also looks at some of the market imperfections. So here climate change does come in. It's one of the externalities that needs to be internalized. And also the way, particularly South Africa, the economy is structured, so that we don't have that inequality reproduced. And then drilling down, as I said earlier, a lot of industrial policy is linked to how we understand the value chain. But value chains, and what often happens is that you don't have a holistic approach to a value chain, which is what we would want to do. So we see tension emerging, or conflict between those on the upstream and those on the downstream within a value chain. Ideally, for industrial policy, we would like to see downstream that can increase demand for inputs, and gives us low cost, high quality, and more reliable inputs that can stimulate that downstream growth. Okay, so our own industrial policy experience. Is that moving? Yeah, okay. Sorry, the clicker, there's a bit of a lag, so Rizal might change it for me from time to time. Okay, so for our own industrial policy experience, what we see is that the growth in South Africa has improved since the 1980s. We've had periods of quite high growth, although outside of the commodity boom period, which was in the 2010s, up to the 2010s, we haven't seen industrial policy or economic growth performing as well. So there was a short period where, I think we all would recall it. It was very fast growth, and that was really linked to, growth in mineral prices and the knock-on impact on our economy. We see changes within the mining value chain, and that's really important for how we're thinking about new minerals and critical minerals that are important for our industrial policy approach. So we move away from gold, although we still see the mining value chain accounting for over half of exports. So it has dropped as a percentage of GDP, but very important role for the exports and foreign exchange earnings from the mining value chain. So it is structurally still very present in our economy. The falling share of manufacturing in GDP, I think people often speak about that. And our major export industry is autos, followed by capital goods. We are seeing some growth areas as well, particularly in horticulture, and I'll talk to that shortly. Horticulture, aside from the exports, but we've also seen it growth in terms of jobs, in terms of contribution to the economy, along with services, have been growing quite rapidly. but we haven't seen industrial policy pivoting to support those areas, which gives us opportunities going forward. We've seen an economy that's creating jobs, but it hasn't addressed the backlog in jobs. So we still have about 40% of our working age population working. It should be 60% if we were to compare ourselves to similar countries. And so we still have this massive gap in people who need to be in employment. We haven't seen the employment coming through the manufacturing sector, and we've seen the job creation coming through public sector and services in agriculture, as I've mentioned. And then, as we know, income inequality remains high, but it's mitigated by social transfers, grants, and free basic services. Okay, there is a commitment to industrial policy and to restructuring the economy, but we've seen some successes, but obviously our production structure hasn't changed sufficiently to address all of these issues. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if we look at our industrial policy, some of the outcomes since '94 is that we've been supporting more advanced and competitive manufacturing to increase local value add and to reduce our dependence on mining-based exports. We've tried to promote inclusion. We've tried to get higher levels of employment. We've supported small business. We've supported Black business in general. And there's been multiple policy frameworks and procurement approaches to support that. We're supporting, quite recently, the increase in support for localization has come through using procurement from the state, but also specific initiatives. So we see what's being done, for example, with Proudly South Africa, or the Masterplans have often embedded localization as part of their approach. And there are others ways that we're supporting that localization. But then when we add in the climate crisis, and that's something that we previously saw as an externality, but now we need to increasingly see it as something that forms part of our industrial policy. So there's two key issues. So one is the improved resilience to the direct impact of the climate crisis, but also the need to promote less emissions intensive production processes, or less polluting production processes. So one of the key outcomes for a greener industrial policy in South Africa is a successful energy transition. So both to reduce emissions and to maintain export markets, improve our resilience to extreme weather, and also to mitigate the impacts of water shortages and droughts on producers. We're seeing that as a reality. Earlier this year, it was a big issue for parts of the country, and also to manage some of the fallout from the rising costs of transport and travel, particularly around logistic issues, but may also impact on tourism, and all of these things could impact on horticulture, which is a growth area at present. And then a core challenge for industrial policy is to ensure that producers have reliable, affordable, and increasingly clean electricity. And I think that informs a very important future directional challenge for greening industrial policy. In terms of the energy transition, it's particularly important for the energy transition is particularly important for South Africa due to the extraordinary coal dependency. We see the coal value chain as a core part of what became referred to as the mineral energy complex. There are other parts to it, but coal is embedded in it, particularly when we look at Eskom and Sasol and the use of coal as part of that conceptualization of our economy. When we compare ourselves to other countries, we know we're more coal dependent for electricity. Even with the renewables that have come in, we still, I think Gaylor will give the figures in his presentation, but we're still far too dependent on coal for electricity, which poses risks. So there's the risk to key exports through the CBAMs that are coming in. There's not only the EU, we're now looking at a UK CBAM, and other regions are looking at introducing border carbon adjustments, and possibly South Africa needs to go down that road as well. We're also looking at the existing fleet of coal-fired power stations, as we've seen with load shedding, particularly last year, where it was out of control. the impact of that on the economy and on our industrial policy. And going forward, we can see the disruptions on Eskom and Sasol, those particularly because of their feedstock, it's going to be issues. I mean, they're confronting it now, but it's going to hit us as we see all of these things getting driven down in terms of, you know, not being able to export carbon intensive products or products that are made with carbon or electricity from coal. We're also seeing challenges around liquid fuels. So the shift to electric vehicles or new energy vehicles is going to be key for the markets in which we export to. And then also South Africa, where the distances range issues start becoming important. There's also the network infrastructure and a whole range. I think we had an earlier discussion a couple of months ago on new energy vehicles. So I won't repeat all of that, but those are also going to be something that are looming large around our liquid fuels industry. So then again, the core challenge for industrial policy for us is that there's a trade-off between greening the existing energy intensive industry or supporting structural change to cleaner industries. So how do we understand that shift and the dynamics of, do we say smelters, for example, are going to shift to using clean energy to continue exporting, or do we want to move to that downstream part of the value chain that's going to be less carbon intensive and can create the labor intensive employment? These are important things, and thinking about where our economy currently sits and the trade-offs in that value chain, it's a very important dynamic that needs to be built into industrial policy going forward. Here we go. Okay, the cost, benefits, and risks. So what are the costs? And we see some of the costs are writing off the coal and downstream technologies. There's a lot of investment in those technologies, and that forms part of the discussion around the just energy transition, but also just the just transition in general. There's substantial upfront costs with some of the new technologies. So when we look at new energy vehicles or EVs, even though they ultimately pay for themselves, upfront they are more expensive. The costs are also disruption of existing systems. So there's institutional disruptions and there's technical disruptions. And we see particularly around the electricity grid and charging stations that needs to be seen differently going forward. What are the benefits? So more affordable and reliable electricity and vastly reduced fuel imports. If we are successful with this shift away from petrol or imports of crude oil and diesel. So that would impact positively on our trade. And also we can see the reliability that would come in if we shift to a new way of producing electricity away from coal. And then impact on jobs and profitability when people don't have to pay 300,000 Rand a month, for example, on their diesel costs to turn on the generators. It would give us access to overseas markets. It would be more decentralized. So we're seeing with solar, it is a more decentralized grid and more resilient. And then there's also, with the new technologies, there's spillovers into other sectors and potential for local production of imports, which Gail will talk to. Some of the risks is that the transition doesn't benefit people equally. And if people perceive that there are going to be risks, there's a potential for mobilization against the change. And that's obviously something that's front and center of where we're at the moment. Also, firms or individuals may be reluctant to take on the disruption, and that may slow some of the transition. And then if there's financing issues and it's difficult or expensive to get that upfront, it obviously has an impact. Okay. Part of what we need to look at is aligning government in terms of an approach to greening our industrial policy. So we've got many industrial policy levers. We don't use all of them. We do use some of them, but particularly around how do we better use our infrastructure, our education system, and even our standard setting to try and support green industrial policy. And we don't always see agreement within government. And that also impacts on how we approach greening our industrial policy. How then do we ensure greater clarity with core objectives so that we don't just deal with lobbies, but rather deal with the bigger picture around the end state, and then efficient consultation and obviously the dispute resolution that is needed. Some conclusions, there we go. Some conclusions. So structural change is disruptive, and greening our industrial policy would be disruptive. We do need to look at how the lobbies that exist for existing businesses are engaged with, so that we work with them in order to promote stable and successful transition. And then when we look at our current industrial policy, the approach has been to avoid things that are too ambitious, too disruptive. So we've done a lot of incremental work that possibly needs to shift, given the challenges we face about job creation, environment, and how we are a bit more aggressive in trying to green our industrial policy and drive some of the possible benefits. And then the new systems that are needed in part to manage the risks and the costs. We've seen a particular challenge between balancing support from existing companies, between the new kinds of production and the ownership between more inclusive and dynamic growth. We need to look at a focus on export and competitiveness, but it can't be that alone. We also need to look at how it's part of our industrial policy, but we're also looking at the domestic market and opportunities within that. And then inclusive growth does need new kind of industries, including green industries, new kind of producers, new kinds of state support, including social economy, community works, and support for labor-intensive industries. And then we also note the importance of building and strengthening cost-effective value chains that promote downstream industrial development. And we know that there is going to be even greater impacts of climate change going forward. So we do need that response. It is a climate crisis. Lastly, some issues for consideration that we've been thinking about and will inform some of our future work is how do we build stronger coalitions to support a green industrial policy? What systemic changes are needed to promote that alignment? And what are the top priorities for industrial policy in responding to the climate crisis? Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Saul, for that fantastic input presentation. And I think it really sets the scene, drawing out the importance of industrial policy, positioning the climate crisis within this context, and how we can possibly think about policies in the future and the way forward. So that was a sort of appetizer, if you like, and we're now getting to sort of the meat of the session, which is specifically zeroing in on renewable energy value chains, and how can we think about them? How do they present in South Africa? What are some of the opportunities that we can capitalize on to increase growth, to ensure energy security, as well as encourage investment into our energy sector. So next, we're going to have Gelo Momoson-Clare. Just a brief introduction. Gelo is a senior economist at TIPS. He's obviously been at the forefront of TIPS's work around sustainability and just transition. And as I mentioned earlier, he's the facilitator for the SAREM, the South African Renewable Energy Masterplan, which is the industrialization plan for South Africa's renewable energy value chain and developing industrial opportunities around that. So I'd like to call Gelo to the front to give his input around localization of the renewable energy value chain in South Africa. Gelo.
Thanks so much, Mohammed, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to see you today at TIPS or online. Yeah, and I think the work that we've been doing really around green industrial policy, as Saul introduced, is really about trying to understand those sort of complexities and trade-offs and how you kind of align the work that you're supposed to do. You see many contradictions generally in these kind of issues. I was a couple weeks ago, I was in Turkey, and we went to see steel factories produce blades for wind turbine. It's a big industry for them going forward. What did I see along the way driving there? I think speaks to South African. It's the place where they make car warships, they make both and they tap into both, but clearly there's some global contradictions towards that, and they also have their own contradictions. And so from a South African perspective, there's many issues in terms of how we deal with that going forward. What's clear is that we have an opportunity when it comes to developing the renewable energy value chain. We don't have a crystal ball in terms of what's going to happen and how to do that best. But the next best thing, I guess, is to do your homework, try to understand what are strengths, what are the obstacles, and how we can make that happen. So as a start, okay, I pressed once only. No, as a start, it's really important to understand sort of what's our journey so far with the rollout of renewable energy in the country. And what you can see is that, of course, off a base, which was very small in sort of early 2010s, there's been some interesting growth, certainly in the last few years. But unfortunately, from a manufacturing perspective, what you can see is that it's very up and down in terms of how much renewable energy we've been having over the years, and it's not necessarily kind of been gradual in expansion. It's been really just haphazard, and that is, of course, brings some issues from an energy security perspective. But from the question that we have here is to build manufacturing, it is highly problematic, and it is very difficult for any industry to grow with a very sort of on and off rollout. And periods of stability without growth is really an issue. Of course, over the last couple of years, things have shifted significantly, with some serious growth over the last couple of years. Can we please move to the next slide? Okay. It's completely stuck. Cool. So over the last couple of years, what we've seen, of course, in South Africa is an opening up of the market, and that has led to significant investment by the private sector, essentially, into renewable energy capacity. There was a massive peak in the first quarter of 2023 in registration of new projects. Now, I think we see that the market is somewhat stabilized around about 500 to 1,000 megawatt per quarter registration. But it's, of course, significant compared to where we were, even 3 or 4 years ago, with literally no projects. And so now we've seen an acceleration over the last couple of years. We see that as well in the ESCOM data, which shows you basically in blue all the renewable energy that has been built by the public sector, and in red, effectively, what has been built by the private sector, as well as all other players, particularly households. You can see certainly from 2022 this sort of massive growth in the market. And now private sector as well as residential, and effectively almost matching what has been built from the public sector in a much longer period of time. So certainly a massive shift in the market and an acceleration in the market that is notable. What does this all mean from an industrial perspective? Well, the first thing to understand is what is the value chain? What is the value chain? Everybody talks about, of course, renewable energy plants. Everybody talks about IPPs and producing renewable energy, but there are many inputs that go into a renewable energy plant. Not just solar panels, okay? And that, because that's everybody talks about solar panels. But effectively, there's a lot of inputs and there's different technologies, and that's really important to understand that even in a solar plant, of course, you have the panels, but you have a lot of other inputs into it. And that's clear with mounting structures, trackers, but also a lot of balance of plant elements. You wouldn't believe the number of kilometers of cables that you have, for instance, into a solar plant. So it's really clear that no matter what the industry you look at, being wind, between lithium-ion batteries or vanadium redox flow batteries, there are lots of different inputs and components that actually form part of the system. And in addition to that, we've got inverters, transformers, fasteners, and the likes that are key components. These components themselves are built on quite a lot of inputs, okay? Input materials. Again, we tend to focus a lot on steel, on aluminum, the sort of primary inputs into any system, but a lot of other actual components that feed into any renewable energy plant themselves, of course, based on the raw materials, particularly what so-called critical or strategic minerals going forward. And of course, there's a much broader ecosystem around manufacturing related services, particularly around things like testing, certification, but also R&D, and all the way to effectively end-of-life management, which is something that has not been very well developed. But as we all know, we need to do something with the batteries down the line. We need to do something with the panels down the line, and we also need to do something with all the blades that we're gonna have. And so developing those industries going forward in a circular loop is really critical as sort of the stockpile builds up. So that just gives you a little bit more of a granular understanding of the value chain to really kind of grasp the fact that there are different components that we can think about. If we look at the existing ecosystem in South Africa, what we find is that actually there's already quite a lot of companies operating in the renewable energy industrial value chains in the country. Again, everybody talks about the IPPs and how many project developers we have, but people don't often look at the suppliers, the manufacturers. And if we look at the solar value chain, the wind value chain, but also battery storage, what we find is that there's quite a lot of players and that have been there and operating in that industry. Of course, Modtech that you'll hear from is there, and they'll tell their story. But what we see is that when it comes to some of the key components like modules for panels, but also inverters, we have some key players. When it comes to some of the wind towers, both concrete and steel, we have some key players. But then when it comes to the sort of more balance of plant elements, cables, fasteners, combiner boxes, also we have some really critical companies. And we see that in solar, in wind, and even more so, I would say, in the battery space. Really on the battery storage element, we've got a very, very vibrant industry that, besides the cell, the lithium-ion battery cell, actually manufactures or can manufacture everything domestically. And so a very interesting ecosystem to build on and that we can support going forward. Yet, if we look at the development of the industry, one cannot ignore the domination of imports. Okay, and this is just a picture of 3 components. So again, if we consider what I've just told you, this is very incomplete because this is just 3 components. Okay, solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, and inverters. Unfortunately, it's very hard to see trade data for a lot of components because they're being lumped with a lot of other things. But so for these two, we can see. I mean, and you can clearly see the jump, in 2023 of imports. By the way, these are $1 billion of US dollars. So in one quarter, close to $2 billion of imports of just free components. Things have, I would say, gone back to more sensible numbers since then, but still extremely high. Imports, 95+% coming from China, not a big surprise for anyone. But just tells you again the sort of difficulty that we're having of matching this increased demand and rollout with actually increased local supply. We see it as well through the sort of balance of the trade balance that we see it for different components. So if you see prior to the boom, we had a sort of negative trade balance for lithium-ion batteries, but it was sort of manageable with the increase in the market. We've seen a massive negative trade balance form very quickly, and similar picture for inverters, similar pictures for solar panels. So how do we kind of go back? Of course, in some industries where we are more structured and things are not moving as fast, and I put here transformers, we've seen a lot more stabilities, for instance, in the industry, where we have actually for some components a positive trade balance. So again, how do we match the growth in the industry on the downstream side, so to speak, because on the project side, with the growth in the manufacturing? And then we think about the opportunities. What are some of the opportunities that can be leveraged? And I think here it's important to, again, work at a disaggregated level to understand what makes sense to localize. It's not because there's demand, or it's not because it is the key component that everybody wants to do, that it makes sense to localize it. We need to understand the strength that we have in the industry to make sure that we can localize those opportunities. Based on the work that we've done, there's 3 core groups, effectively, of components or parts that we can think about that would make sense to be localized. The first group would be what we call big wins. These are products, effectively, that we largely make already in South Africa. These are effectively the companies that I showed you in the table. They make these things, they're already part of the value chain, and certainly there would be potential for growth going forward. You see it with some of the towers for wind turbines, some of the inverters, some of the steel, and as well a lot of the mounting structures and trackers, but also a lot of the mineral beneficiation that we see already in the country. For instance, manganese sulfate with the manganese metal company down in Nelspruit. And that is the only company outside of China that makes manganese sulfate for batteries, for instance. So this is really, we call it big wins. We could call it no-brainers if you want. Like it's literally the ones that we have to kind of grow. We already have a base. We should support the development. Then you've got another set of industries where we also have a lot of capabilities, but realistically, there's just smaller industries from a renewable energy perspective. And we should also develop them, things like tanks and fasteners and cables, battery management system and energy management systems. These are industries that they are smaller by industrial standards because they tend to be focused on components. But again, we have either great capabilities, or we could develop those capabilities relatively easily. And so, certainly, I think they would flow with effectively developing those big wins. We would go and try to develop those industries, and that's really important to kind of understand that as well. And then there's a third group, effectively, where call it high stakes, high rewards. These are the sort of the big ticket items that most people think about when they think about renewable energy industry. The lithium-ion battery cells, the solar cells, the blades, the hubs and nacelles. These are big ticket items that we currently do not make and do not have in South Africa. And yes, if we could localize those, it would be great. It would bring great benefits, but then we have to get real. It's going to take some work. Okay, it's not going to be easy. It would require significant interventions to actually make these industries viable in the country. So that is obviously a slightly more disaggregated and nuanced understanding. An unknown that is not on this graph is end-of-life management, and it's not here because I would honestly be hard-pressed to put it on this. I don't actually know where it would fit. It's really difficult to understand the opportunity to develop end-of-life management today. It's something that we need to look at and understand where it's viable in terms of recycling and sort of circularity for different components. So it's not on the graph for now. Okay, so if we look forward, what do we think is required to build industry and actually get that diagram to be realized? The first thing, we need stable demand. That's quite clear. It's a prerequisite. In the work that we've done, we show that at bare minimum to build manufacturing, we need 3 gigawatts of rollout of renewable energy per year, ideally, ramping up to 5 gigawatts. And that is to answer one simple question: how much do you need to build an industrial value chain? Okay, which is a very different question from obviously answering, say, what do you need to have energy security or to achieve low carbon goals? Okay, it's a very different question, and I want to be very clear on this. The Presidential Climate Commission recommends 6 to 8 gigawatts per year of renewable energy to answer these questions around energy security and low carbon transition. To build an industrial value chain, it would be great to get 6 to 8, but with 3 to 5, we can build an industry, and that is really a different, set of questions. What we find in our work is that if we look at our peers, South Africa is actually well positioned to develop local manufacturing in the value chain. China is a bit of an outlier in the space, very difficult to compete with. But when it comes to other locations, we are actually quite well competitive. However, it is clear that the environment is very competitive globally, and that if we think that we can go without having some significant supply side interventions, build an industry that is really comprehensive, we are going to face some significant headwinds going forward. And so it is really about building that industry going forward. We need some supply side intervention. And so if we look at a little bit of the detail, what does it mean? Well, on the demand side, what is the priority? Demand, demand, demand. Okay, this is the priority. We need as much demand for renewable energy as we can get. Domestically, of course, is the primary port of call, and then hopefully in some of the export markets as well. So stimulate demand is a prerequisite. If there is no demand, pack your bag and go home. You're not going to develop an industry. It's very clear. Okay. We need to make sure that it is consistent, that demand really, is built in a way that can support industrial development. And I want to illustrate that through the imports of panels, but also wind turbines historically in South Africa. I mean, I think it speaks for itself. Look at the up and down. I mean, particularly on the wind side. That's the imports of a product that we do not make, okay? Wind turbines. In some years, all the way back to zero, okay, given the problems that we've experienced with procurement. How do we expect an industry to develop with a demand pattern like this? It is really difficult, to go from very high to all the way to zero in 2018, 2021, 2022, went back in 2023. 2024 is just the first quarter, so it will be higher down the line. Similar in the solar industry, ups and downs, ups and downs, ups and downs. That's not really easy to have manufacturing development based on a demand pattern that is like this. So we need the demand to be a lot smoother going forward. We need to tap into all markets to do that. And I think that is a critical development over the last couple of years, is that we need ambitious public procurement, large-scale public procurement, as well as other type of public procurement, particularly, government buildings and so forth. We need ambitious private sector procurement, and we need also a rollout, of course, at other small scale sort of residential and sort of community and commercial spaces to drive that demand. From a manufacturing perspective, more is more. Really, we need more demand. We also need the public sector procurement and the policy support to be a lot more, aligned with our localization objectives. Often, we've seen that it is not linked at all when it comes to some of the procurement. Provide government support for rollout of renewable energy without some conditionality around localization. Or at times, our local content objectives are completely out of sync with the market dynamics in terms of supply. And so we need to smooth this out to really have a bit of a more cohesive ramp up. And of course, we need to look at all the cross-cutting issues that could hinder the rollout of renewable energy going forward. These are well known around the physical infrastructure, particularly the grid, but also the market infrastructure, the policy frameworks, and the finance. Cost of capital is still extremely high, in the country, for instance. But that is only one part of the story. As I said, yes, demand, but demand is not all. We have a very competitive environment globally. Are we the only one who are trying to develop a renewable energy industry? No. So, we have to come down with the realization that most countries are trying to do this, are providing substantial amounts of subsidies and support to the industry. That's of course the case of the EU, of the US, of China, but also Korea, Brazil, Turkey, and the likes. So we can say it's fair or not fair. That doesn't matter. It is the situation, that we have to deal with. And so certainly from a South African perspective, if we are serious about it, we need to look at having some supply side supports to our industries. What we've proposed is to look at the tax incentive for manufacturing investment, which is the 12I, and particularly with a focus on green tech, possibly. We beef up the value proposition in terms of our industrial spaces, particularly around special economic zones, and also increase testing and certification capabilities in the country. It is absolutely crazy to hear that some companies have to ship their product to the EU or to the US to get them certified to be able to export them down the line, at great cost and time wastage. We need to think about using strategically our trade instruments. In some cases, we may need to have exemptions of duties if it doesn't make sense to have a final product that comes in duty free, but an input into a final product that we're trying to make here fetch duties. Or we may have some targeted protection to develop actually the industry. That would probably certainly make the case for battery packs, for instance. But again, battery cells we don't make. We want them to come duty free. And make sure that we have mandatory quality standards on a number of products. What we've seen is that a lot of substandard products are coming to the country due to the lack of either standards or the lack of enforcement of those standards. And so it's really important that we, again, protect our local manufacturers that are trying to thrive in the country. And then we need a value chain deepening. That is partly regional or with our partners in BRICS, for instance. I know everybody talks about battery value chain, so try to explore how we can do that more meaningfully, but also with the connected industries. If we are serious about developing a battery value chain, we can't do that without the automotive industry. Okay, so that is of course a critical link, but there are many other linkages going forward. Thirdly, we need to look at the ecosystem, the broader ecosystem, the cross-cutting factors. One thing that we can put a lot more emphasis on is supplier development. And here, certainly an OEM-led cluster platform linking the different parts of the value chain would play, a big role. It's brought some really interesting successes in other industries, and it would really beneficiate a lot of the companies to effectively tap into the value chain. We'll hear from Modtech their experience. I'm sure, many would benefit from a more structured platform to actually enter the value chain going forward. We need increased, focus on technology commercialization, notably, and provide a lot more support when it comes to, rolling out new technologies, supporting access to equipment and machinery, as well as knowledge, and supporting our new entrants and our emerging suppliers in a more structured way. When it comes to skills, again, it hasn't been to date a significant bottleneck, but as the industry grows, it will become one. And so how do we build effectively more structured pathways, from learning to earning, build the right qualifications, make sure that what comes out of the training and education institutions matches what industry needs through sort of matchmaking is just becoming really, really important from a manufacturing development perspective. And of course, we want to develop the value chain in an inclusive fashion. And so there's definitely a lot more emphasis that needs to happen around issues like decent work, gender inclusions, and many other issues around ownership that could be introduced as we roll out the value chain, particularly through strong public procurement. So in closing, I want to share just two thoughts that kind of summarize effectively where we are in the industry going forward. These are the global imports of lithium-ion batteries in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And you can see that recent development have propelled South Africa actually have one of the top destinations, okay? And that is quite notable, that we actually know roughly in sync with our positioning in terms of global population, global GDP, global electricity production. We are actually roughly in sync when it comes to our imports of lithium-ion batteries or panels, solar panels, for instance. So we've now kind of reclaimed a bit of a positioning that is in sync with we should be. Of course, there's some countries that have big imports, but still, South Africa is now, interestingly, one of the key markets, certainly over the last couple of years, for renewable energy. And that is bringing really a lot of interesting, potential and underpinning a lot of the discussion that we're having. But at the same time, we need to be real. If we look at global manufacturing capacity of a lot of clean tech or green tech components, it's no surprise that the dark blue here is China. China dominates over 80% of the production of any input into the renewable and battery storage industries. And so the space is crowded. And entering into that market will require significant interventions from a supply side perspective if we want to seize the opportunities going forward. So a real opportunity, a real potential, but it will require decisive actions if we want to seize the opportunities going forward. And that's all I wanted to share. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kelo, for that very data-driven and informative presentation on the domestic renewable energy value chains and the extent to which localization is an option for the different elements of the value chain, as well as different types of components. There have been quite a number of questions coming through. So while we're preparing for the next presentation, maybe I can just channel one or two of them to Saul and Gelo. So we have a question from Bruce Spears, and this is for Saul, I think, but Saul or Gelo, I mean, you both can share your thoughts on this as well. It's very interesting summary of the issues that face South Africa. I was curious that there was no mention of the African Continental Free Trade Area, either as a goal market for South African industrial policy or in helping shape regional value chains where South Africa will participate. Is there any particular reason for the exclusion? And I guess extending the question is this an important consideration that we should account for? Saul, maybe you can start with that.
So yes, I mean, I think it's still early days, and part of what we need to think about, and it's come through because I'm looking at the chat now, in some of the comments in the chat, is how do we think about a market that's broader than South Africa in understanding the opportunities to grow our own domestic production capabilities. So we can't just focus on the narrow market. The AFCFTA does give us an opportunity. So it is something that is there, but it's still coming. I think we do need to factor it in our planning and in the way we see it, but it is not there yet. So it's an opportunity that we need to start building on. But in doing that, it can't be a one-sided export of South African products to other African countries. It needs to be trade, and that's something that we need to look at. I think someone else put in a question on critical minerals and the regional value chain, and the importance of that. So in how we think about what we're buying from the region, and the opportunities, that also becomes part of this broader understanding of how we trade with our neighbors. Thanks.
Great. Gelo, if I could just pop a quick one to you as well. A question from Kiru Sishongwe. How can green industrial policy navigate the dangers or risks of market and governance failure for it to deliver the desired outcomes? So how can we better navigate the dangers or the risks of these two types of failures, market and governance failures?
It's like the $1 million question. Eh? You know, you'd rather ask me the result of the election and be easier. To be honest. But yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the key challenges that we faced again is sort of, for me, it's the lack of alignment. You know, we've been having this lack of alignment between a lot of our different policies, and I think that is a challenge. You know, we're asking a lot of procurement processes to effectively do industrial policy when it's not necessarily their mandate, their role, or they don't necessarily have the skills. And so how do we kind of provide that alignment going forward? You know, how do we make sure that, as we said, you know, if there is any sort of public procurement or public support into a procurement process, it could be a grant, it could be a loan, it could be, you know, a guarantee. You know, there is effectively industrial policy in the mix, and it supports our localization objectives and our broader objectives. But that has to be built in, you know, from the get-go. You know, if it comes in, and now you're asking effectively departments or institutions who are not directly linked to the DTIC to do that, they may face a lot of challenges just because they don't really have the skills or the mandate to do it, or sometimes don't have the money, to be honest with you. And so how do we kind of bring that in a more holistic fashion, for me, is really important. Then the second challenge that we face, certainly in the renewable energy value chain, if we accept the fact that now a lot of the market is driven by the private sector, you know, how do we get the private sector to buy local inputs into their project? Okay, and that is really critical. We cannot necessarily force the private sector to do that. So the best way to get the private sector to buy local product is to make sure that these local products are competitive. That is effectively the best way, you know. And so again, then you revert back to industrial policy. You know, how do you get that done to make sure that we have competitive industries that can produce the right specs at the right price, and then you have got a winning formula. So for me, you know, how do you build in that into the process going forward for public procurement? A lot easier in theory, but it has to be thought through from the get-go. And how do you provide the right environment and the right supply side support to make sure that our industries are competitive, then you will drive, the private sector procurement.
So we have one question from the audience, but I'm going to humbly request if you could please park it, because we have our next presenter waiting. I know there's a lot of interest. We've also got a lot of online questions, so we will try our best to attend to all of them. I just want to be fair to the rest of our presenters. Thanks, Gelo and Saul for answering some of those questions. As Gelo mentioned in his presentation, we do have a lot of domestic suppliers that input into the renewable energy value chain in South Africa, and we have one of them that's joining us today to present on their experience in integrating in renewable energy markets and value chains. So just by brief introduction, and I hope I'm pronouncing your surname right, Gerald Nianaber, I hope that's the right pronunciation, is a partner of Motech Services, which is a growing high-tech engineering and manufacturing business, which is poised to move from servicing traditional markets, such as mining, to new emerging markets, such as the renewable energy and associated value chains. Gerald has extensive experience in several key industries in South Africa, leading the development of OEM parts and dedicated to providing OEM part solutions for the world's most critical markets.
Good, Mohammed. Thank you very much for the introduction, and also just a big thank you to the TIPS team and for the hard work that you're doing behind the scenes for us as a manufacturing industry. And I think our portion of manufacturing has been a very small portion towards the whole supply chain that Gelo and the team are trying to protect. So, no, I think that if you look at the presentation that I'm going to give you, it is a reiteration of the previous slides that Gelo has presented as a case study of our experience on a journey trying to enter into the renewable space and maintaining a stable manufacturing environment over a period of time on the basis of projects coming forth and then no projects, but trying to really just maintain a stable pathway towards industrialization for ourselves as a company. So about Motech Services, just a short introduction and then we'll move on. We would consider ourselves as a medium to large manufacturing facility that we specialized in manufacturing or localizing components based on a need that was demanded for the renewable energy sector. And we always say to ourselves that it's about location, but if you had to look at the last slide that Gelo showed about China's competitiveness and the manufacturing demand that China has placed on the world, location is not everything. It really revolves around the place. So, we've as a company tried to position ourselves so that we can sustain ourselves as a business, and merely for the fact that we then just could not focus on renewables, and we sort of focused on a broad base of industries to maintain a stable outflow of our production. We could move to the next slide. So this slide really speaks to a long journey. This journey started basically in 2009, where we started moving into a renewable space, and at that stage, that it was all new to everybody, and we put in some hard work to start really pushing and getting our company up to a standard where we could provide services to OEMs, developers, the PV market, and the wind industry. So if you look at the journey from 2009 up until 2024, It's just been a consistent grind in terms of evolving our internal policies and standards and quality control plans to meet the severe demand, because we needed to compete quality-wise at an international level and give enough comfort for the OEMs to be able to supply us with information, bring us up to the standards that they demand internationally so that we can enter into this market. And this slide would also speak to you about what Gaylor said about the stability. You know, this journey of ours has been, I would say, ups and downs, and it would have been a different picture if we had a stable demand of projects with consistent policies. You know, every time a bid was released, there was new rules, new regulations. Every time there was a move in government or anything like that, you know, we would not receive policies. Every round had its own demands, and we've had to continuously just gear up to that. I think you had to look at 2019, where we could really start seeing progress on moving forward. It did. You know, then we could start planning forward. We could start really putting finance models together, and you know, it would have stabilized our growth. But then we had the move towards private projects. The private projects was a challenge in itself, because then we had to change the business model, and we had to align ourselves in terms of this strategy to be able to cater for both the re-projects and for private projects, so that we can fall into a space to be able to offer services to both. 2020, we had a significant change where we actually introduced our first PV tracker. We aligned ourselves to be able to manufacture trackers locally at a price level that would be competitive for developers to be able to use us in the market. And that in itself faced challenges, because as you would see from the previous slide of Gaylor, that 80% of this market is dominated by the Chinese. And it wasn't an easy exercise for us, but we've managed to do it, and we've managed to gain significant traction in the recent year towards that. The next slide. So our challenges were simple. You know, any company that experiences growth or moves into this market would realize that it is a big market. It's not a small market. It's a big market. But we had to deal with the normal growth challenges because we saw that there was huge potential. I think that everybody saw that there was potential in that. But the journey that we took to be able to get us to the point where we could supply significant volumes into the renewable sector was challenging. And then the first one we faced was a skill base. You know, we needed specific skill bases to be able to do the needed production, to be able to cater for the severe volumes that are required by these projects. And I think after a period of 3 years, we managed to stabilize the need. And finance, you know, rapid growth in a challenging economy that we are in now really didn't aid us in this growth. You know, that is why it was important for the TIPS team, and we had many other government institutions that tried to assist, but the system was just too cumbersome, and we had to just find alternatives as business to sustain the rapid growth, to be able to stabilize it into sort of an industrial rollout plan. Imports, I think Gaylor spoke to this. The moment we started moving to private projects, we needed to, as a company, reassess ourselves and say, you know, how are we going to not fight the imports, but, you know, assist the imports? Because on the one hand, the imports were driving us down, price was driving us down, but it made us really look at our manufacturing, our costing models, and we were fortunate enough that, you know, we could align ourselves internationally, that we could really intensely look at these costs and see how we can change our models to be able to move forward, you know. And we were fortunate that big players came to the party, and we have managed to stabilize. But I think anybody in manufacturing would realize that our costings in South Africa just doesn't warrant the prices that come out of China or internationally, and that is why, you know, it's important that we have these sort of discussions and we align ourselves closely with the guys at TIPS to work together in industry to either stabilize policies or implement certain tariffs that are conducive to the midstream, our downstream manufacturing needs, days like this where we can actually stabilize. So we can move to the next slide. So how did we overcome these challenges? Because challenges in growth came over quite a long time. We were fortunate enough that we had people like the policymakers where we could approach them and say to them, guys, that look, there's certain elements where we are struggling and we need to put things in place. It's been a consistent journey, and we firmly believe that our country needed energy, but, you know, as a manufacturing sector, to place stringent tariffs on imports would, number one, just kill the progress, but on the second hand, it would help us. And we've sat down with them for long and worked with them and had long discussions how we can actually align that it would be a win-win situation for industry and for the manufacturing sector. And I think the results of that are the sort of policies that we are starting to see being implemented, and we hope that they would be implemented quite quickly. Second point that we want is the stability. I think the key word that Gaylor used was that we need stability in the projects. The pipeline that has been placed upon manufacturing up until this point has been extremely erratic. The moment you gear yourself up and you think that you are going to start manufacturing, it would disappear. You have a lull for a 2-year period, and then all of a sudden you have to rapidly ramp up. And we are hoping that the volumes would stabilize. The moment the volumes stabilized and we thought that we're going to have a good run, then it would be privatized. The moment it got privatized, then, you know, the volumes reduced. We changed the model, and then we see stability again. And that's what we've experienced as a company consistently. And we hope that through days like this and through policies that Gaylor and them are trying to put in place, we can create that sort of stability in the market. Our next slide. So our prospects, because I think everybody's looking towards a 2030 market, is that we we are keen advocates for local and manufacturing local, but we've also realized that in an industry that needs electricity, there are certain elements that we as manufacturing need to look at, and we believe that the downstream supply chain is very crucial to job creation in our country, and we all know that that is what we are all advocating for. So as a company, we are continuously in a fighting situation to create jobs locally, keep out imports, but keep out imports at a certain level that it's conducive to growth, but it's not. It would not fight the growth. We hope that by having days like this, we can come to an amicable solution, and that guys like Gaylor, TIPS, our bodies that we work through, SAWIA, SABVIA, we can all sit together and formulate constructive ways and plans to stabilize our pipeline. Because I think that is our key into manufacturing. The moment we stabilize the pipeline, we can put through constructive business plans with constructive, stable manufacturing to be able to supply these huge projects. And yeah, so from a way that we are looking forward to this, we're positive about the growth. There's a lot of potential in the market. We believe that manufacturing, if the policies are implemented, we believe that it would sustain growth in manufacturing. There are the challenges that we've said, and we have faced many challenges, not just on steel, but on labor, skills. But these are challenges that as businesses we managed to handle. But these challenges for us are much more manageable if we have stability. The moment we can create the stability, government policies, the non-changes in policies, us as manufacturing can start creating jobs, because that is what we are vindicating for. Next one. Yeah, so, Gaylor and the TIPS team is, we just like to, as a company, we'd like to thank you guys, because I think that it's not just about writing policies, but you guys are seriously driving something home that we hope will be implemented shortly. 2030 seems far, but if you look at the journey that us as a company have taken since 2009, it's not very far. We are now at the point where we've got just over 2,000 components localized, and we now need the policies to start kicking into place so that we can stabilize manufacturing to be able to create jobs for a country that is desperately in need of it. So thank you to the TIPS team for having days like this so that we can just voice ourselves as a manufacturing sector to be able to move forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Gerald, for that presentation and taking us through your journey as a firm in this position, pivoting towards integrating into a new lower carbon market, but also shedding light on some of the challenges and the roadblocks with that experience. I think it, as you've referred to Gaylor's presentation many times, it integrates really well, going from the sort of high-level view, drilling down to the actual experience within a very clear, well-defined market. So thank you so much for that. We have one more presentation, so we'll just defer the questions until after that presentation. And then, yeah, we encourage people to ask questions and to make use of the expertise that we have here today. So last but certainly not least is we have Faisal Ernest, who's a South African trade unionist at SAPAWU. Faisal organizes, facilitates, evaluates, and reports on capacity building for members in his leadership role at the union. He also supports operational and strategic leadership structures and represents the union in legislative and stakeholder structures. Faisal, it's a pleasure to have you here today. And we'd really like to hear from you around the union view of the energy transition, from the position of SAPAWU. And what are some of the key challenges and themes that you see emerging in this transition from the union perspective? Faisal, over to you. I know you don't have a presentation and you're going to do a verbal input. So please go ahead when you're ready.
Good afternoon, Mohammed. Thank you very much. You put me under pressure because I think in your opening you had indicated that you want to conclude all of the presentations by 2:30. That's 5 minutes away. So you put me a little bit under pressure.
No. I don't mean to pressure you. So you can take an extra 3 minutes if you want.
Okay.
Being very generous.
Yeah, no, we take whatever crumbs comes out. But yeah, I think the request was for us as organized labor to try and give a perspective on what our expectations and our aspirations are within the environment of renewable energy and the changes that are anticipated in industry and of course in the workplace itself. So I'm going to touch on a couple of key issues for us as organized labor. I hope I'm not going to be chastised. I am employed at SAPAWU and I do serve as the representative of COSATU. And through the NEDLAC processes, actually, we deliver our perspective as organized labor as a collective. So I think, as everybody would probably expect and anticipate, our major and key focus is around creating decent work for within the economy of the renewable energy. Job security is obviously a very, very important aspect to us. We want to see permanent, formal, and sustainable employment. We've had circumstances in the past where, for example, with the expanded public works programs that was introduced in some developing economies within the country, but those job opportunities, because they were, for want of a better word, informal, they were not permanent. They were very seasonal and open to abuse. And we don't want to see a repeat of that within the renewable energies environment. So we want to see permanent jobs being created within the sphere of renewable energy. We want to see employment and investment within the flailing manufacturing industry. I think the presentation that was just made now is that even from the view of business, we need to have stability, but more importantly, we need to have sustainability. And I think from government's point of view, and obviously from the private sector, we need to have investment within the manufacturing industry for it to be sustainable. The renewable energy industry must comply with employment targets and with practices as agreed through SAREM, through the SAREM processes, where I think Gailo's presentation spoke to some of the targeting processes that have taken place through SAREM, and we obviously want to see some kind of compliance and monitoring of those targets and practices being held accountable. And these must relate to issues of incentivization, for example, which one anticipates would happen for boosting the renewable energy industry. I'll come back to the issue of incentivization a little bit later. The other major area that we want to look at is also a transformation in ownership, in worker control, particularly as a principal and strategic objective. And as I've spoken about, the investment. So We want to establish public investment in infrastructure and manufacturing businesses. So there's a role for government. We want to see financial support in the form of low debt facilities for businesses to be able to have a financial stream which they can tap into and not be overburdened by a huge debt facility that they would then have to struggle with over years. And so we want to see the kind of financial support to ensure entrenching locally produced renewable energy goods, particularly in the component sphere. We want to see public and worker ownership that will arrest procurement positively for locally produced components. We want to see the promotion of employee share ownership plans, commonly known as ESOPs. It's something which, as organized labor, we are very keen on embarking on and seeing come to fruition. There's been talk about ESOPs for many, many years, in fact, decades already within our economy, but it seems never to really take root. We think that this is an opportunity within the just energy transition for us to start looking quite seriously at the introduction of these employee share ownership plans. We want to see worker participation in company boards, for example. So we want to see a real transformation in industry where workers are brought on board, not just as a social partner, but in fact as a business partner, and to participate in the strategic decision making within business. So we want to also, as I've spoken about transformation, we want to see real transformation in industry. There's been a lot of talk now during the presentations of the steel industry, the aluminium industry, the battery manufacturing, the transformer industry. And so we want to see the kind of real transformation of ownership and of control and investment in these industries, these mini industries. The third broad area that we are very interested in as organized labor is obviously within the industrial policy, and I think SAREM and Gailo touched on that quite extensively. So on industrial policy, and more particularly and specifically within the sphere of localization. So we want to see the transfer of technology. We want to see the capacity of local manufacturers being improved and in fact maximized and optimized, because again, links to the presentation that was just done by Motec as well, is we need to have the skills, we need to have the sustainability of business, and that can only be augmented through ensuring that we capacitate businesses and workers within the industry, and there must be that kind of transfer of technology. As organized labor, we want to see and we want to really experience a joint implementation of various government departments. So, for example, Department of Science and Technology, Department of Trade and Industry, the Department of Higher Education and Training, particularly through the involvement of the Sector Education and Training Authorities, the SETAs, and then, of course, with local industry. It mustn't just be a talk shop. I think we want to see active joint implementation of and partnering of these various entities. We want to also see the protection of local industries. I think the Gerald, who had just done his presentation, also spoke about import tariffs and taxation and that kind of thing, and the incentivization of things. But we want to caution here again that, we've had experiences. I'm based in the Western Cape, and I've worked extensively within an area along the West Coast called Atlantis and Mamre, and many years ago, it was created as an import and an export haven for businesses to set up. Today, it's virtually a ghost town. employment rates are high in the 80s to 90% within those areas. So we don't want to see a repeat of those kind of circumstances. Ensure that local industries are protected, and that, of course, that we have substantial investment in those areas in infrastructure, and ensuring that those don't become white elephants and the like. It's important for us within industrial policy to ensure that there's a just energy transition. So we are quite concerned, obviously, within the world right now with the effects of the fourth industrial revolution. Of course, as it's a growing industry, and we basically testing the waters with renewable energy, I think not only in South Africa, but internationally, one would only be able to measure success when there's an implementation of different strategies. So we just want to say that we need to ensure that whatever energy transition there happens with the introduction of renewable energy, that we must ensure that there's justice, social equity, and the like. I think also related to the issue of localization, let's just be conscious of the effect of or impact of multinational corporations, particularly those that are foreign or which are owned offshore. We need to be cognizant of that kind of effect. The second to last area that we're really concerned about is, well, not concerned about.
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you if you can conclude.
2 minutes. Thank you. So we think that with the introduction of renewable energy, there's going to be a boost for the recycling industry, and something which we've not really looked at as a country to really formalize and to structure. So we think that the potential for the recycling industry is quite big, particularly with the introduction of the renewable energy. The last point that I want to make, and in fact, I don't want to be facetious, and I apologize for any offense taken, but organized labor must be seen as a critical partner within this process of transition. And I want to appreciate the role that's been given to organized labor through the SAREM process. We've been involved in the consultations and in making representation on behalf of workers in the process. But again, I mean, let's just look at what happened today. It's a last word, and maybe sometimes it's a good thing to have a last word, but normally when the last word comes in, it's cramped into a short period of time. So we want to see a serious kind of inclusivity of all the social partners, but particularly of organized labor in a meaningful engagement around renewable energy. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Faisal. And I'm going to make a personal note of that. So the next time I put the labor presentation first. It was the cards just fell that way, but the point is taken, and we certainly will accommodate in a better way in the future. So thanks so much for that presentation. We have quite a few questions pouring in, and I'd also like to open to the floor and the people online. If you are online and you want to ask your question verbally, you can request to unmute, and you can do that. In the meantime, there was a question on the floor, so if we can please arrange the mic. If you don't mind, just introduce yourself, say where you're from and who your question is for.
Hello. Thanks. I'm Philippa Rodset, Manufacturing Circle, and I have a question for Gaylor. The emphasis on stable demand, and I think the importance of that in dealing with current situation of feast and famine, which is so difficult for our local manufacturers, as well illustrated by Mr. Ninaba and also other of our manufacturing circle members. So in this context of stable demand and the fact that in the renewable energy space, we've got two key procurers being public and private, As the SAREM facilitator and being involved in, and part of many other people in the development of the draft document, which in my view has been very well facilitated and talks to a plan, but also talks to implementation or a program, which I think is equally important. We know at the moment that the SAREM draft is in its final form. Sign-off is yet to take place. However, I'd like to know from Gaylor, in your view as the facilitator, what areas could still be implemented or worked on, notwithstanding the final SAREM, still needing to be signed off, and perhaps you could give us some steer, maybe for private sector procurers, given that I'm asking that from the manufacturing circle or industry, as to something that might be more within our locus of control. Obviously, ideal world, SAREM signed off and we go forward and implement as per, I think the well-structured discussion process. But given that we're still waiting, for this document to be signed, is there anything that we could look to do in the meantime in the interests of being agile? Because, this is a rapidly developing space. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, maybe we'll take a few. There's sorry, just while I bring up my question list here. Yeah, there's quite a few questions from our online community. So one of the pointed and other provocative questions as well from Shilizi is there a particular reason why SAREM has not been implemented? Short and sweet. So I think let's go with those two for now for Gaylor, and then in the meantime we'll get the other questions in line.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Strategic change of mic. Yeah, thanks a lot for the questions. So I think, Philippa, thank you for the very hard question about how we can move forward in the current situation that we're into. I think certainly from the private sector side, there's a number of things that can still be done. As you indicated, of course, we would like to see a coordinated approach, well structured, implemented as developed, as conceptualized. But there's certainly, even in the absence of other interventions, a couple of things that, in my mind, need to happen, and that could be championed by the private sector. One is the issue of testing and certification capacity. So around testing and certification, but that's a lot that can be done by the private sector to develop that capacity. Often, we look to obviously to the public sector to do that, and that would be an ideal scenario. But in the absence of, I think there's a lot that certainly the private sector can go and support, and there are many companies that do that, on a global stage, to really help manufacturers to certify panels, fasteners, trackers, turbines, batteries, and the likes. And certainly what we see in any event is that there's no harm in bolstering our capacity, in doing the testing and the certification, and that can be done by public and the private sector. The second thing, if we're serious about localization on the private sector side, we have to go and find leadership with decision makers. And those decision makers, they don't lie in manufacturing companies, and they don't lie in IPPs. They lie with off-takers, the companies that are procuring that electricity. Okay, It's the JSC top 30 if you want, or it's the big guys, okay? The mining companies, the big corporations that are procuring gigawatts and gigawatts of renewable energy at the moment. They decide down the line to impose localization conditions on their procurement or not. Okay. And so that's where we need to have a lot of leadership from the off-takers to, of course, within reason, and within a sustainable pattern, increase ambition when it comes to localization. And I think we've seen some companies do that very well. But we'll see. We've seen others, prioritizing other elements of procurement. And so I think if we could get some sort of coordinated ambition, from business on that front and leadership, and that would really have a big impact on the development of the industry going forward. And the third aspect, which I'll also mention, is around that OEM cluster that we think would be relevant. That coordinated approach between OEMs, tier 1, tier 2 companies, we need then the OEMs to be on board. It's one thing to say, well, we need the OEM cluster, but if the OEMs are not on board, you're dead in the water. Okay. Many of these OEMs, of course, are not South Africans by design. And so, how do we bring them on board, and how do we get that structured approach with some of the local suppliers, and to start introducing that thinking on a not on a national way, but on more of a regional and ideally on a global way, because of course those industries are structured in a global fashion. Why we don't have nacelle manufacturing in South Africa? It's because there's only a few plants in the world that manufacture nacelles effectively for the globe, and so if we have to attract one, that would be a big win, but it's difficult to do so. So how do we plug into the value chains going forward is important. So for me, that's some of the areas. I mean, there are others, but where we can look at the private sector certainly taking some steps. Hopefully, we will be in a position to launch SAREM soon. We've completed the work of developing the master plan. We went through public comment process last year. We incorporated those comments. I think Faisal made reference to it. We negotiated targets between government, business, and labor. And we have a final document. We're now working through some of the government processes to get approval to effectively launch that plan. And we hope that we will be able to do that in the near future.
Thank you. Thanks so much for those responses to the questions, Gelo. There are a lot of questions pouring in, and unfortunately, we are victims to the passage of time, and we don't have unlimited time. So we're going to do our best to try and get all the questions. If there are questions we can't get to, we've provided the emails in the presentations, or you can just contact TIPS directly, and we'll connect you with the speakers to resolve any questions that are not. We have one question from our online audience. I believe it's Livu Mukiti that wants to ask a question. If you can just unmute your mic. Please also follow the same protocol. Introduce yourself, where you're from, and who your question is for.
My name is Silvani Mukiti. I work in the DTIC, an enthusiast of industrialization, although I work in the area of economic transformation. I have questions just for two of the presenters. The first one is to the presenter that was on MoTech. I would want to, because it's exposed to the area of manufacturing, particularly of the technology and the components in the renewable energy space. I would want to get a sense from him in that with the current components that they're manufacturing, at what level of tech should the country be looking at firstly, as it moves in manufacturing those with guaranteed uptake, as the lady that spoke before also spoke of that. That's the first one. The second one is around what policy instruments is he proposing to the policymakers, for example, for the protection of local industries and localizing of some of the technologies. That's the first one. The last one is to my colleague from the trade union. I hear there's a lot of noise around the employee share ownership programs and broad-based ownership schemes, but I'm hearing less around the economic benefit to the workers. Instead, I'm viewing that as a tool to the captains of unions, not to the workers themselves. And economic benefit and decision making does not actually go through to the actual workers, yet the corporate unionism that we see in South Africa is taking shape, and they're saying nothing. And I would like to pause at that. Thank you.
Thanks for those questions. So maybe just to summarize first, Gerald, the question was, in summary, what components or what level of technology should we be looking at, and what kind of policy instruments will help for the industry? And then I'll move on to the question to Faisal after that.
Lifa, thank you very much. It was a good question. And just to shortly answer your question, which Gailo might have touched on previously, is that there are certain components that is just not possible to manufacture into our country. He placed them in three categories, which are your big wins and then your higher stakes. The big wins, believe it or not, is currently being manufactured in the country. There's a thriving industry that is supplying the renewable market sector, which is creating jobs, of which we do report back on a monthly basis to government through our SED commitments. But there's a capacity growth in terms of what we need to supply. So it's a systematically gear up that we as industry have in technology, which is already in place. It's just a matter of us developing it to meet the demands once the policies stabilize our supply of projects. And this would be a natural cause of stability, which is our belief in terms of the technology. In terms of technology, I believe we have it, but we do not have the technology in the country for the big ones. In order to create this, you need to see the components to be able to realize that it's a big step for us as a manufacturing sector to be able to take on those challenges. I hope that answers your question.
Great. No, thanks, Joe. Faisal, over to you. And just to recap, the question was around, the employee ownership shares, representation in boards. My sense of the comment was, there's not a lot of focus around what these types of mechanisms or structures, the types of economic benefits they would provide to workers. Could you shed some light around that?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for I think it was Ruben, for the question. Appreciate it. Yeah, I think I said in my discussions that employee share ownership plans is a concept that's been around in our body politic in the workplace for a very, very long time. I mean, and in fact, it's morphed, it's evolved over time. I agree with him that there seems to be a propensity on investment by trade union investment companies into the private sector, and it appears as that was the be all and the end all of it. I think that the principle of employee share ownership plans is to really transform the strategic decision making within businesses. So actually being part of the company boards, being privy to the kind of strategic outlook of businesses, so that when decisions are taken, they become cognizant of the needs of the employees of those companies and not just the expectations of shareholders. ensuring that there is a transformation of the benefits that workers are enjoying within those companies. So wanting to see a much more real contribution by workers in the strategic decision-making of companies, and not just a financial investment in companies and therefore a financial return on investment for, as he puts it, the corporate unions, because that does seem to be, I agree with him, there seems to be that propensity within South Africa right now with the blossoming of trade union investment companies. But the idea of employee share ownership is that workers to the core become involved in decision making to change their real condition.
Thank you so much, Faisal. So we have reached the end of our session. What I am going to do is I'm going to give each of our speakers a minute to basically summarize their core message that they want to get across to the audience today. And we'll start with Faisal. Since you started last on the presentations, you can start first with the closing. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, so thank you, Mohammed. And firstly, let me thank the TIPS group for inviting us and for allowing us to be part of the dialogue. And it's precisely that, a dialogue. It's not an event. I think it's going to be a process of us sharing our different perspectives, and hopefully, as some of the speakers and I think the contributors during the course have displayed, that we hope this is a start of the process, and that the process is going to continue, and we're going to have many more engagements for us to share our perspectives. I just want to say, let us, I know there was a question about why SAREM has not been implemented yet, but I think we need to give our support to SAREM. We need to ensure that we pressure the decision makers in legislation to ensure that SAREM becomes a reality. I think SAREM is a very, very progressive process, and I think the idea, particularly in the renewable energy master plan, is the thought that all the master plans need to talk to each other. So we're looking at a very holistic process. So it's not just renewable energy, but there are various other master plans that are being discussed, and I think it's a very, very progressive way of taking our democracy further and ensuring that there's economic transformation. Thank you.
Great. Gerald, over to you. Final closing.
Mohammed, short. We need action. We need implementation. It was clearly said. We need these policies to be signed off. We need them to be implemented, and we need teams like TIPS to keep on fighting for localization and job creation. And thank you very much for the day.
Short and sweet. Thank you so much, Gerald. And then finally in the room, Gelo, and then Saul.
Yeah, so I think I'll try also to touch on a couple of questions that in the chat. I think first thing to really internalize is that the space is very competitive as I move forward, and then yet most entries that have a stake are trying to protect it. See that, and it's back to the US, that's a couple we see that, and we see that, you know, with all the scramble for critical minerals happening, China, Europe. So the space is competitive, and so if we are about grabbing those opportunities, we need to take the challenge seriously. And so that means that we need to do our homework in terms of where we think it's competitive for us to go forward. So for me, you know, you can go and develop an industry either because it's competitive on a global basis, or it is strategic to do so. So in some cases, it's just strategic to do so to make sure that we have security of supply, or that we not affected by price volatility for a lot of services. And so that is what the work that we're trying to do, to really highlight where they are being. Because there are linkages between the number of industries and what we're going to do as well. Something actually developed together. But only if you're going to sell what that is. But in most cases, there's actually quite a lot of education that's possible. There's not very few examples that. And so doing the homework to understand where it's viable is critical, and we'll bring and the implementation of the Masterplan so that we can have a coordinated approach that really reap the benefits. I would say the goal is really to get more of just electrons out of renewable energy.
Great. Okay.
I'm going to be half a minute. So very quickly, in thinking about greening our industrial policy, we need to look differently at our industrial policy. We need to look at what support we can give to the downstream. We need to think about how we can ensure industrial development and job creation in supporting downstream industries, but also how we use our levers differently. We've got levers available to us. We can use them differently, and we can use them more strategically. And there's definitely an important part that we need to be thinking about doing so going forward. So we're hoping no one's mentioned elections, but we're hoping the new crop of ministers coming in take note of that and think about how we can better support and more proactively support our industrial development through green industries and greening our industrial policy. Thanks.
Great. So with that note, we'd like to conclude. Thank you so much for our physical audience and our virtual audience. There was a question about the presentations. We will make those available for people. Just reach out to us if you're having any difficulties, and we'll be more than happy to help. Thank you so much for joining us today, and take care. Safe travels back home.